a really fascinating panel coming up now, and it's my privilege to turn it over to its moderator, Dr. Evelyn Forget.
Thank you very much. We've got 4 great speakers today who are going to talk about the topic of work and human worth from very different perspectives, very different experiences, and very different backgrounds. And so I don't want to take a lot of their time, but I want to mention 2 themes that we're going to hear. 2 themes that we're going to hear throughout this panel. The first has to do with the prevalence of precarious labor. You might have heard our finance minister, Bill Morneau, you might have read in the Globe on the weekend. Bill Morneau says that precarious labor is here to stay and that Canadians are going to have to get used to navigating a new economy, a new world of short-term jobs, poor quality labor, and that the job going forward is to ensure that we have social policies in place to help Canadians navigate this new landscape. So I'd invite you to think about how basic income fits into that as you're listening to our speakers this morning. The second issue I want to mention is one that comes up very often when we talk about basic income. There are always people who worry that if we offer people enough money unconditionally, that would allow them in principle to lead a life of moderate dignity, that we're going to somehow undermine the work effort, that people are simply going to stop working. And one of the things I'd like you to listen to today as we go forward is how desperately people want to work, how badly people want to work, because we derive a lot more than a paycheck from the work we do. We derive our sense of self from work, we interact with each other through the kinds of jobs we do, and I think that challenges us a lot, particularly as the economy is changing going forward, to ask ourselves what role work plays in our lives. How do we make sure that we're valuing the very important work that sometimes happens outside the paid labor market? Work of caregiving, work of creative people, for example, volunteer work that doesn't attract a paycheck, but is still necessary for the way our society functions. And how we interact with one another, and how we see work playing a role in our lives. So without taking any more time, I'd like to turn the mic over to our first speaker this morning, Lee Cormie. Dr. Cormie is Professor Emeritus of Theology at St. Michael's College and the Toronto School of Theology, and I invite you to read the rest of his lengthy biography in your program notes, please.
Good morning. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this illustrious session, and I've already had enough of a taste to know how good it is. I don't think I realized quite so fully how fast, how big the train of basic income programs were, initiatives were, that it had already left the station and was gathering, had already gathered lots of speed. In Toronto, in terms of discussions underway here, in the province of Ontario, across Canada, in many other nations around the world, it's really remarkable how widespread the discussion about basic income as a solution to many problems, or a partial solution, a step in addressing many problems, has become. I wholeheartedly agree with the principle in the Symposium overview that human dignity, security, autonomy, and self-respect should advise the mechanics of the creation of the model for basic income, and not the reverse. In other words, values and sensibilities, matters of faith and hope, should be part of the discussion from the beginning. And I look forward to the rest of the day's proceedings as an illustration, an expression of people and organizations working together, in quotes, to help Canadians imagine and build a just, healthy, and creative society. This is a great place to be today. I want to introduce, as part of the discussion, several different points. There's not a single teaching in Christian churches or other churches about work or basic income programs, initiatives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different signposts or points of reference, landmarks, in the evolving Christian social teaching. It's ecumenical and increasingly interfaith as well. I'm going to go sort of far afield at times, but I think that the issues that I raise are haunting the discussions in the most concrete ways about basic income proposal and the alternatives and the other programs and issues that they relate to. I've told several people already, point one, that my first experience in this room was in 1961 as a student in an English course. Since then, things have changed a bit, and me too. And that's one of the points I want to make as a sort of point of reference, how much the world has changed in the last, say, 50 years or 60 years or 75 years. In the course of these changes, there's been all kinds of debate and confusion about what constitutes ethics, or faith, in fact. Some have asked, whatever happened to ethics? Some have talked about endless postmodern relativism, as if people today couldn't possibly negotiate with one another to come to any agreement about what's right and what's wrong and how to proceed. Not least of all, the debates have centered on what constitutes the center of a life of faith. What kind of issues, what kind of concerns, what kind of preoccupations should be central and which should be marginal to the life of faith. These discussions influence what kinds of choices we make, what kind of matters and issues we think are central, not only what stands we take on particular issues, but what issues are central. So second point, and related. In my experience since 1961, I've worked closely with Canadian interchurch social justice coalitions. I've worked with, later folded into Kairos, Canada, the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, Social Affairs Commission, the Canadian Council of Churches and related organizations. I have studied and researched the World Council of Churches, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, more recently changed into World Communion of Reformed Churches, Lutheran World Federation. And in terms of practical politics, I've been interested in social movements and especially in interfaith social justice, eco-justice sort of collaboration. In those streams of thinking and activism, I want to point to two broad trends or tendencies. One was, beginning in the 1960s, the project of neoliberal globalization. We identified this with the Reagan administrations and the Thatcher governments in England, and more recently in Canada, the Harper government in particular, as embodying these sensibilities, this sort of global project. And there have been neoliberal or neoconservative theologies as well, most visible in the United States in the sort of Christian right or Christian fundamentalist right that has been so important in the Republican politics since the 70s at least. And more recently and more marginally in Canada as well. But the third point, there have been other powerful streams in the churches as well. These are not exactly, in some cases, official teachings or mainstream teachings that have been very suspicious of this first line of development, this neoliberal sort of ethics and politics. The groups I mentioned before have a long tradition of lobbying governments and the public, lobbying the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and other sort of organizations to move in somewhat different directions. They've been highly suspicious of that first stream that I mentioned, that first powerful stream that I mentioned, and have sought to provide alternatives. This is especially clear in the development of an alternative common sense, which is emerging in the churches and in many other places in Canada and around the world, I think. And I want to talk a little bit more about this emergent common sense. I think that the Basic Income Initiative fits in this alternative common sense as neatly as anybody could imagine. The fourth point of reference. There are other big changes sweeping the world, and I can only mention them, but they're directly relevant to our conversation. The proliferation and cascading new technologies of all kinds. Huge topic. Relatedly, the globalizations of culture, economies, and politics. Our ways of thinking are increasingly influenced by what we learn, who we're in contact with, other people, other places, other parts of the world. There's been huge geopolitical shifts. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and subsequent changes. The rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa as alternative centers of economic creativity and power, and political and cultural power as well. We've, among other things, in terms of ecological issues, the rise of concern about climate change. The 2008 collapse, financial meltdown and collapse, which presumably, at least for a while, involved everybody in questioning the earlier financial wisdom about how to organize and structure the economy. And more recently, concern about the Anthropocene. It was really big news. There was the Anthropocene Working Group that produced a report last month, September. It was widely in the news about the magnitude of the shift that's underway in the world and the power that humans, new capacities that are being exercised by humans. Okay, I referred to an emergent common sense. Many signs of this in many faith communities and interfaith social action groups. It involves a rethinking of faith as a whole, in fact. Examination of conscience, confession of sins, meditation and prayer and liturgy are being transformed in countless ways by these new sensibilities. Notions of repentance and conversion. Pope Francis is especially strong on the call to conversion that the concern about these issues requires of us. There's adding new acts, new works to the list of the works of mercy. Core values, dignity of the human person, notions of integral human development, the whole person, the whole community, the whole society. Centrality of notions of equality and justice, not necessarily absolute equality, but relative at least, substantial, and certainly notions of minimum bottom lines. More recently, and it's hard to believe maybe, but it is very recent, the concern with the earth, or notions of integral ecology, have been advanced as central to our faith, as Christians, as Muslims, as Buddhists, as others. There have also been methodological and epistemological developments, rethinking about the significance of ignorance and knowledge, the limits of knowledge, the horizons of hope and of faith, ethics and politics. So these debates are in process, in flux, underway around the world. Centrally to my discussion today is the growing, spreading theological suspicion that there is an idol or idols at the heart of our discourses about the economy, about the mainstream discourses. So not only is economics in this view not external to faith or marginal and secondary and optional, but that these concerns are central. They have to do with how we imagine the Creator and how we imagine creation and how we see, where we see ourselves in it and what our roles are. So this is prominent in the work of John Paul, Pope Francis in particular, in recent years. Critique of consumerism is increasingly central in these circles. The notion of new manufacturing, of endless new gadgets, things, items, and needs, the cultivation of the sense that we need these for our humanity. So in the midst of all of these discussions, far-ranging as I've said, I think that the Basic Income Initiative fits quite neatly, not as a solution to all those questions, but as an obvious, increasingly obvious step forward, an ample or just basic income, is an increasingly obvious step forward in terms of taking another step and addressing particular issues and relating to addressing those broader range of issues I've mentioned. Let me say a word about the Anthropocene. I'm going to cite 3 prominent authors who are writing about this, just to tweak your memories. They're talking about global changes at accelerating pace and what previously unimaginable scales. referring to both the biophysical and the socioeconomic changes that are altering the structure and functioning of the Earth system. So it includes alterations in, and this is a partial list, land use and land cover, urbanization, globalization, coastal ecosystems, atmospheric composition, riverine flow, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, physical climate, marine food chains, biological diversity, population economy, resource use, energy, transportation, communication. And the emerging common sense among the scientists who are studying this, a wide range of the earth sciences and increasingly social sciences as well, the turning point in this expanded human capacity to affect so much of what's happening, of the planet and of life on the planet, that the date for marking this acceleration, this expansion, is around 1945 or 1950. In other words, in less than a century, a little more than half a century, human capacities to shape the character of the planet and of life on the planet have exploded, for lack of a better term. Some people are talking about a good Anthropocene, that this is going to make new science, new technologies, wonderful new possibilities for life flourishing on the planet. The other people, and by far the majority, and the driving people in these debates about the Anthropocene, have had a much more negative and worrisome perspective. Climate change would be the obvious example, that the rates of climate change are accelerating dramatically, that we are experiencing more severe climate change, hotter summers, colder winters, more extremes, glaciers are melting, etc. And that very quickly in the future is rapidly approaching, in a future of dramatic tipping points, of cascading catastrophes. Whichever way we go in these debates about the Anthropocene, what's clear to me, and I recommend to you, is that at the heart of these discussions are also matters of hope and faith. They're matters about how we understand the Creator and creation, how they understand reality and possibility, ignorance and knowledge, hope and faith. My final point. This is follow-up Senator Siegel's advice, encouragement. Central to these discussions are questions of hope and faith. So I'm going to quote and leave with these words from Pope Francis. It's easy to say, don't lose hope. But I say, do not let yourself be robbed of hope. Perhaps hope is like embers under the ashes. Let us help each other with solidarity, blowing on the ashes to rekindle the flame. But hope carries us onward. This is not optimism about easy progress. It's something else. It does not belong to any one person. We all create hope. So the Basic Income Initiative is not a magic bullet, but it's a little or maybe big step in the right direction of addressing many issues that confront us for the future. So let us not be robbed of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Penn. Okay, our second speaker today is Amanda Robar. If you can just come to the podium. Amanda Robar is from Aurora, Ontario. She attended George Brown College and is certified as an educational assistant. She's enjoyed volunteer work with Epilepsy Canada, York Region, and the Canadian Cancer Society, and especially enjoyed assisting with elementary school musicals. Amanda's agreed to tell us something about her experiences in the labor market, in the job market, and also with ODSP. Just to get us started, Amanda, can you tell us what an educational assistant does?
An educational assistant is someone who assists children with special needs in the classroom to make sure that the teacher can help out all the students, including the ones with the special needs.
Thank you. I see you've brought a friend with you. You've got a service dog over there. Would you feel comfortable telling us something about your disability?
Sure. I have epilepsy, For those of you that don't know what epilepsy is, it's a seizure disorder, and Kira is my seizure response dog.
Thank you. Does your epilepsy affect your ability to work in a standard job setting?
Well, I need a job that can not only accommodate my needs, but Kira as well. So in the school setting, there were children and staff with allergies to dogs, so I couldn't work in those classrooms. I was a casual EA, which meant I only worked when someone was absent, but was called frequently enough that it was almost like working a full-time job. Although I appreciated being called, I found working a full week was too hard on my physical health, and that led to stress and took a toll on my mental health, and eventually I resigned from that position. Since I've gotten back on my feet, I've spent time looking in the papers for a suitable job, but I've had no luck finding one. I wish my seizures were under control, but they are not. I do need to take time off for specialist appointments and tests at different hospitals. Sometimes I may need a day or two to recuperate if I've had several seizures in a day throughout the week. I know that I won't be able to perform the best I can if my body and mind haven't recuperated properly. I wish I didn't have to tell my colleagues about my disabilities. I want to be as independent as I possibly can. But it's kind of hard when you have a service dog. I'm constantly being questioned about Kira and feel like I'm being judged by the community.
Can I ask why you chose to become an educational assistant?
Yeah. Well, when I was in elementary school, there was an EA in the classroom that was assigned for another student, but he helped me out immensely, and in high school I did a co-op placement assisting in a grade 2 classroom and worked primarily with a child with Down syndrome. I realized that I connected with this student really well and other students with disabilities in the school as well. This gave me drive to go give back to the students like I had been given assistance. Everyone deserves help. After high school, I began to volunteer in the school where I did my co-op, or done my co-op. This particular school has many types of classes for special needs children. I've had first-hand experience seeing those children's strengths and the intelligence that is hidden beneath their disabilities. I wanted to help them to be successful and feel good about themselves.
It seems to me that working is really very important to you. Can you tell us why?
Sure. Just because a person has a disability doesn't mean they aren't capable of working. The less a person has to do, the following can happen. They get bored. This can cause depression, followed by being angry at themselves and the world. This can turn into a serious issue affecting mental health. You begin to feel worthless and sometimes even the "why am I even here" situation.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Working makes you feel like you're accomplishing something. You're teaching and learning new skills at times, and maybe even meeting new friends, perhaps someone who you connect with and understand one another.
Did you have difficulty finding a job that let you use your skills?
Yes, I did. As I mentioned earlier, when people hear the word epilepsy or seizure, they make an assumption that the person won't be able to do their job. They think of their employee will constantly be falling to the ground. This is not true. There are many different kinds of seizures. Tonic-clonic is only one type. As a teenager, I had a job at a fast food restaurant. I worked there a few months, but once my employer knew that I had epilepsy, he stopped scheduling me for shifts. I was never let go or never fired. I just stopped getting called into work. When I decided I wanted to work with children, a college counselor told me I would be a danger to the kids if I had a seizure and that I should reconsider what position I wanted to go into. I did eventually get into the ECE program part-time, as a part-time student, but did not finish the program when my health intervened. I had brain surgery to try and get my seizures under control. After several years of volunteering at a daycare and elementary school, I knew I wanted to work in this particular field and enrolled in the Educational Assistant program at George Brown College. I completed the program at George Brown, graduating with honors. However, even when I did get hired several years later, it was considered a special project because having a service dog in the classroom was something new, even though I had been volunteering and working as a lunch supervisor for a few years with my service dog in the classroom.
Do you work for pay now, or do you receive ODSP?
I'm on ODSP, but I'm also trying to work from home as a Sensi representative.
And Sensi is home sales of?
Yes, it's wickless candles and with scents and many other products.
Thank you. So what kind of experiences have you had with ODSP, Ontario Disability Support Program?
Well, as for the process of being approved to receive ODSP, how low do you want a person to feel? It's a system that needs to change. They dig really deep into your personal life to see if you qualify, and then review it as if your disability is going to go away. I'd like to focus on the last two letters of ODSP. SP, support program. What type of support am I getting from ODSP? Well, the only positive thing I can say about ODSP is that it covers most of my meds. However, it's a system you get stuck in. When you get a job, they take away half of what you earn, so you never really get ahead. You're not allowed to have more than $5,000 in your bank account. I receive $930 a month, which includes an allowance of $78 for my service dog. I've been on the rent geared to income housing list for 12 years. I understand that everyone needs a place to live, really I do, and right now I have that with my parents. However, not being able to live on my own deprives me of a chance at independence. What I get from ODSP isn't enough to rent an apartment or even a room because you also have to pay for utilities. That leaves no money for food. Then I have to look after Kira. Her food costs more than $78 that ODSP allows me, and that doesn't include veterinary care. And to keep up her training, I take her to weekly classes, and in a month, that costs me $135. What I get from ODSP is not enough to live off of, and I'm positive that I'm not the only one in this position.
Thanks, Amanda. I want to come back to the way that some people believe that we derive our sense of self-worth from our jobs. I think one of the consequences of introducing a basic income is that we're going to have to rethink what we mean by work. For example, many people leave the formal labor market to take care of family members. It's important work, but it's not market work, and they aren't paid for it. A lot of artists work only part-time so that they can focus on their creative work. So I'm going to ask you, if this were a perfect world and you didn't have to worry about meeting your basic needs, what would you spend your time doing?
Well, I came to realize that as much as I need Kira's help, she wasn't fitting well into a typical workplace. So I decided I would have a job where I worked from home. So in June, as I mentioned, I became a Sensi representative. I've spent months watching training videos and learning the process. I participate in weekly training calls where I can take notes and ask questions on how to improve at my job. No one told me I had to do this. I was off on disability and couldn't stand doing nothing to contribute. This job may seem silly to some, but I feel having this job has helped me grow. I think that it is much better than being depressed with nothing to do.
Thank you. One last question. If we had a basic income tomorrow, how would it affect your life?
Oh gosh. Well, with basic income, I'd be able to support myself and Kira financially with less stress and work a job with hours I could handle. For a healthy, balanced life, the optimal hours I could handle would be about 3 days a week for 4 to 5 hours a day. I know that there are other people with similar needs to me. Job sharing could be a great solution. I know it isn't much, but it would be something positive for me to say, I am part of the working community and the community is willing to help.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Okay, our third speaker this morning is Kaylie Tiessen, and again, Kaylie's biography is in your program notes, but she's an economist working for Unifor, which is, I believe, the largest private sector union in Canada.
Sure is. And in addition to what my bio says, I think it's also important for you to know that I'm actually a Mennonite. I won't go into lots of detail, except to say that the foundations of how I approach social justice were formed in the early years that I spent at church, and then later on working for Mennonite organizations, or like we like to say, sort of the Mennonites around the world. One other point is that this. My presentation should not be considered official Unifor policy so much as it is the thinking of one staff person within the Unifor organization, and we'll see how that proceeds going forward. So a couple of things to start. We are being confronted with indignity and degrading circumstances in the labor market, in our public services and income support programs every day. Here are a few headlines from recent years. Ontario's minimum wage goes up by 15 cents, but still falls short of a living wage. WSIB policy hurts workers and pushes them into humiliating jobs and unemployment. Workplace violations are widespread in Ontario. Working poverty continues to rise in Toronto. We already heard what Bill Morneau, our finance minister, said earlier this week. Ontario's soaring social assistance poverty gap is the starkest for single adults as welfare rates stagnate. Our EI system is not working, and we must all push back against precarious work. These are troubling headlines, and they tell a story of how income security has eroded and that people are feeling increasingly frustrated. Just this week, we witnessed an impressive act of civil disobedience when our Prime Minister visited the CLC Young Workers Conference and was met actually with a cohort of young activists who turned their back on him to symbolize how they feel that their government has turned its back on them. That has something to do there with the first headline at the top. So income security has eroded and people are feeling frustrated. But that erosion has not just been in one facet. There have been a few. One, Ontario's labor market is changing. Some of you may have seen this research in the past. It's not mine, it's Tom Zissis. This is a picture of career pathways from the 1950s, where you may have started in the bottom of the labor market there in the blue section, semi-skilled work, entry-level positions. Maybe you started in the green area, skilled workers and frontline managers, but you could always move your way up. There's sort of a career ladder. Not everyone made it to the top of that pyramid, but there were opportunities to move forward if you worked hard. And if you were willing to learn. This is the labor market that I have been introduced to the labor market as a young worker into. You see that there's knowledge jobs at the top. Those have sort of grown, that orange section. The blue section, the entry-level positions, has ballooned, and the middle jobs, the green section, has actually shrunk. And it means that the pathways for moving from the bottom of the labor market, if that's the way you want to describe it, through to the top have diminished quite a bit. The research here found that if you enter into the labor market in one of these states, either here at the top or down at the bottom, you're likely to stay there. So if you are lucky, like me, to have entered into sort of a knowledge job when you graduated from school, and one of my first mentors is actually here today, so thank you for that. You're likely to stay there. You know, your LinkedIn page says that this is what you do, that's what you're good at, and that's kind of what people go on. But if you enter into an entry-level position, then you're likely to stay there, even though your skills might be such that you could be moving up and doing different jobs. And that's a really frustrating thing for many young workers today. So that's one piece of the change. Another is the minimum wage and the poverty line. So this just goes up to 2014, but it shows how a full-time minimum wage job actually doesn't even allow you to live out of poverty. That's probably something that doesn't surprise you if you're in this room, but what might surprise you is that in 1976, it actually did. We have made choices in the past where the minimum wage job was at least a pathway out of poverty, if not more. Okay. Another piece is my colleague Aglika Ivanova and I have been doing some research on precarious work and instability and how there's different facets of precarious work. One of those is low income, but there are other pieces as well, or low wages. So part-time work, this is based on Ontario. Part-time work is growing faster than full-time work. Involuntary part-time work has increased slightly. The gap or temporary work is growing faster than permanent work. GDP per capita is growing faster than median wages, and the gap is actually astounding. I'm happy to show you those charts and graphs sometime if you're interested. Low-wage work is on the rise, and low-wage work is measured as being 2/3 of the median wage. The share of workers who have variable hours has increased quite dramatically. So that means from week to week, you don't know how many hours you're working. If you have a job, you know how much money you make per hour, but you're not actually aware of how much income you will have because your hours are varying. And there has been a small but negligible increase in the share of workers who are working multiple jobs in order to get by. So our assessment of job quality in Ontario is that it has actually decreased quite dramatically over the last 20 years. Okay, a second piece is that income supports have been squeezed. Here's a picture of the poverty gap for people who are receiving social assistance. We heard some stories already of the experience of this morning, and this is a graphical representation of how the amount of income one receives from social assistance compares to the poverty line. So the blue there is the poverty line, and this is from 1989 to 2014. So you can see, the NDP were in power up here, and we had a large sort of increase in the amount of income people received. Then the Mike Harris years came in right about here. There's a slow decline. Interestingly enough, even though the Liberals have been kind of tinkering with social assistance, it's always in the budget, but if you compare it to the poverty line, there aren't very many family types that are actually better off. In fact, we're just kind of holding steady, and people's ability to make ends meet is not improving. What about the unemployed? Just a quick note, because I think it's important to have this in the back of your mind as we're thinking about basic income today. This chart shows the number of unemployed Ontarians who are receiving employment insurance benefits, and it's only 29%. We also heard this morning that only about 40% of people would actually be eligible for employment insurance, another income support that is not measuring up today. So here's a quick picture of the number of unemployed persons in Ontario. We had a huge rise during the recession, and it slowly come down. So we have 500,000 unemployed people in Ontario today. That's a lot of people. The story that we tell ourselves about those people is they should be writing resumes and getting out there and doing everything they can to find a job, because if they find one, then they'll have that pathway out of poverty. If they work hard, they'll rise to the top. Guess how many job vacancies there were during that same time period? I haven't put it up yet. Does anybody want to guess? Not quite. It's close though. The answer was 0, and it's very close. 65,000. So there's 500,000 unemployed people looking for jobs and 65,000 jobs available. And we have this system that's forcing people into poverty in order to try and find work. And these sort of last few issues, or all of these issues that I've been talking about, involuntary part-time work, long-term unemployment, they all kind of blew up during the recession. But the overall shift in the labor market is one that started happening before the recession hit. So it's more structural than it is cyclical, and it means that there are things that we need to do to change the system. I think that one of the reasons we've allowed all of this to happen is that we're pursuing growth and flexibility. And we have this idea that the more flexible the labor market is, the more flexible and responsive businesses can be, the stronger our economy will be. So this is the picture that I think we get from that. It's a very strong individual. I attempt to do yoga 3 times a week. I can't even get halfway there. It's a very difficult pose. And this is, I think, what people envision when we talk about the flexibility that we're trying to achieve through the sort of deregulation policies. This, if it works, is what we're actually getting. Something very, very different. It's certainly flexible, but it's also very flimsy, and it means that people don't have any control over how they are moving through the labor market, how businesses are kind of moving through the process of trying to gain loyal customers, etc. And the thing is that there are scores of research that says weaker labor market institutions coupled with lower public spending are actually contributing to income inequality, and income inequality is a drain on economic growth. Again, we can talk about that more another time if you'd like. Okay, so that was a lot of information. The point I really want to make is this. If we want a flexibility that is strong and graceful, controlled even, then we have to fine-tune all those little tiny muscles that allow an individual to both hold a pose as well as gracefully and expertly transition from one sort of state of being to another. And I have some ideas. My proposal is this. We need a basic income system that works at toning all of the little tiny muscles. And that means that a person who's receiving social assistance today, or hopefully a more enlightened form of social assistance, can transition to working tomorrow. That one person may be writing a book this week and working as an airline pilot next week. You may be a musician this year and a law student next year. If we expect that people are going to be making many transitions in their life, then we have to also provide the stability that is essential to make the risk that one has to take in order to make those transitions actually palatable and worth it. So that doesn't mean one policy, it means many, but at the core of all of them is this basic income principle that we all deserve enough to get by. So here are a couple. Labor market institutions. There's a long list there. Robust minimum wage. Down at the bottom, robust enforcement of the standards we have, very important, as well as implementing new standards. The ability to bargain, paid sick days, fair scheduling, these are things that people need in order to plan for their lives and have stability. Public income security supports, more enlightened form of social assistance, child benefits, public pensions, sales tax credits, worker safety and insurance, a government focus on job creation and quality job creation instead of all of that low paid work. We call this sort of pre-distribution or pre-income supports, childcare, education, apprenticeships, retraining initiatives if you lose your job and need to get back into the working world. And by that, I think we should be focusing on retraining people for jobs that actually pay a living wage or higher. If you lose your job in a manufacturing center, go back and retrain as a personal support worker. That may be very personally fulfilling, but it is not actually necessarily a stable job or one that lifts you out of poverty. Other stabilizing supports include affordable housing, mental health supports, healthcare. Again, the list goes on. So, a universal basic income. I think we need one, but my idea of what that looks like is one where everyone gets the support that they need, but not everyone receives exactly the same support. If you think about universal healthcare, does not mean we all receive exactly the same treatment, whether we need it or not, but it means that we each receive the treatment we need when we need it most. And it also means that we're all covered no matter what our situation in life. All right. So, we need a system that builds strength and control and grace in order to move from one job or one situation to another, to another. And we need to be able to move from one life's work to the next life's work to the next, whether that's in the paid labor force or in a volunteer position, taking care of family, etc. And these are things that we can accomplish if we start to make different choices. I'm really, really thrilled to be a part of that conversation. Thank you.
Our final speaker in this panel is Shaun Loney, a fellow Winnipegger. Shaun has founded or mentored 11 different social enterprises, and so I think he's going to tell us a little bit about what social enterprise is and how that fits with the concept of a basic income.
Yes, great. Thank you. It's nice to see Professor Forget again. I was in her university class many years ago. One of the things I remembered most is that governments can have a lot of control over what kind of society that we have. But I first wanted to tell you a quick story. It was a cold January day in Manitoba, and I was driving north of Winnipeg to see my mentor, Stan McKay. Stan was a former moderator of the United Church of Canada and a Cree elder. And I was there to ask him some advice as an elder. I had given him tobacco the week before about the book that I was writing called An Army of Problem Solvers. And Stan said to me some things that day that were very, very interesting. First of all, he was recently asked to endorse a campaign that would call on government to increase social assistance wages, social assistance rates, and he refused. The reason why a Cree elder, former moderator of the United Church of Canada, would refuse to endorse a campaign to increase social assistance rates is because he believes it's time to do better. And in many First Nations, when you reach 18, it's almost like you can become fully dependent all on your own. And he had explained these are not what the treaties were all about. He told me that the United Church of Canada set up a healing fund after he was moderator. He didn't have involvement with setting it up, but he was bothered by it because only Indigenous people could apply for the money, as though only Indigenous people need healing. And in fact, his main premise is that we all are needing healing. And he explained to me that we used to talk about how we wanted to move away from handouts to hand-ups, and we're way beyond that now, and basic income being an important part of that. We're now to handshakes. And this is important because it involves all of us. This whole story isn't about the Amandas of the world, it is about all of us in the room, and I think that that's important. What he was describing is very important because it's a new paradigm that's unfolding and a very, very exciting one. Many of you be familiar with Jane Jacobs. She was a untrained economist who told us we shouldn't be building our cities out. We should be building them up and having interesting neighborhoods and communities built within those neighborhoods. But I think the most important thing she said, and if there's one thing I'd want you to remember about what I'm to say today, is that poverty has no causes. We've got to move beyond thinking that poverty has causes. She explained that darkness has no causes, it's the absence of light. Cold has no causes, it's the absence of heat. And poverty is nothing more than the absence of prosperity. So the question is, how do we structure our society so that people can be prosperous and achieve prosperity? And that's what I'm going to briefly talk about today. I work at the Social Enterprise Center in Winnipeg. It's a 30,000 square foot industrial hub for social enterprises. And what are social enterprises? They're non-profit businesses. This is a movement that you're going to be hearing more and more about. As Dr. Forger said, we started a social enterprise in Toronto, actually, called Building Up. They're 2 years in. They work with the Black Daddies Club. Social enterprises take the community-orientedness of a nonprofit and the market discipline and entrepreneurialness of the private sector and combine them. It's very exciting. In Scotland, there are 5,000 social enterprises. They add 200 every year, and 112,000 people work for social enterprises. Many of them would previously have had no access to the labor market prior to that. Some of the social enterprises like Build has insulated 15,000 low-income households and hired people with very lengthy criminal records to do the work. Manitoba Green Retrofit, one of the things that it does, it hires graduates of Build, but it also does bed bug remediation. I love bed bugs. Why? There's something good about bed bugs. I know they're awful. I'm just trying to be provocative. Because you can create employment from remediating the bed bugs and move people out of poverty. And this is how exciting this new paradigm is. Imagine all the money we're spending on poverty, and can we somehow convert it to prosperity if we begin to see our world in a different way? Aki Energy is where I spend most of my time now. It's focused on First Nations. So we've done $7 million worth of geothermal work, First Nations in Manitoba, in just 3 years with no government money. And what was needed was a relationship with government in order to do that. And we've also started a farm in the Garden Hill First Nation. My grandfather and grandmother were ministers in Garden Hill, United Church ministers, in the late 60s and early 70s. My grandpa had the last garden in Garden Hill, and we've started a 13-acre farm there and a healthy food market, which is very exciting. The premise of the book is that we've got lots of problems. You wouldn't be here today if you weren't concerned about what those problems are. But the premise is you need a problem solver to solve a problem. And this is a step we've been missing for at least 2 generations. So who are the problem solvers and how do they go about solving problems? Well, I would argue social enterprises are a very important part of that equation. Social entrepreneurs also very important in the small farm movement. The difficulty is that government gets in the way of problem solvers getting at the problems. And let me give you 2 quick examples. So $7 million of geothermal work on First Nations, the two largest geothermal installers in Canada are Indigenous social enterprises that we started. And none of this cost any government money. Well, the federal government stopped us from doing that work in May, from expanding to new First Nations, for the simple reason that they're defending a colonial paradigm at INAC. And basically we take utility bills that are like this when we go to the house. Utility bills are cut in half, and then we use some of the bill reductions, which are massive, to pay back the upfront cost, which was financed in order to do the work. It's a very transformative model. But INAC said they were losing control over what was happening. First Nations were making decisions without their permission. And so they said, no, you can't do that anymore. You've got to apply for funding. And we've got a little pot of funding. And so I actually got a call from the minister's office, 2 calls. I want to tell you quickly about both of them. The first call was, Mr. Loney, we know you're very upset that your $8 million project at Waiwasikapo First Nation was stopped. And, but rest assured, we're going to restore your government funding. We don't have any government funding. That's the whole point of it. 2 days later, phone call came back. Mr. Loney, we've got super news for you. We found $8 million for you to do geothermal work at Waiwasikapo First Nation. And you know what our response was? No, we're not taking your money. Because there's 599 other First Nations that deserve to have economic development opportunities. Not taking it. So it's been an incredible battle all summer. And I think we're getting there. We've got the attention of the minister. The book has been an amazing help with that. It's just like shrapnel inside INAC, and I use it in kind of military terms. You notice the title of the book, An Army of Problem Solvers, was actually inspired by Gene Stolfitz, who was a founding executive director of the Christian Peacemakers, and he once told me that we could have stopped the war in Iraq. All we needed was an army of peacemakers. And the concept kind of stuck with me, is it wouldn't it be interesting if we had an army of problem solvers, and what would it take to do that? So the second thing is Garden Hill First Nation. We actually had a visit from Minister Bennett a month ago. And you have to understand, this model has INAC just completely torn upside down. But the minister was looking over 13 acres of farm and 1,000 chickens, turkeys, an orchard. This is just our second year. And explained to our minister, absolutely nothing you see here has any support at all from the federal government. But you do put money into Garden Hill, it's a remote First Nation, which is a cesspool for diabetes. $1 million a year goes to the Northern store that sells 95% unhealthy food. That's your taxpayer dollars. We don't get anything. Why? Because in order for the food to be eligible for federal government incentives, it has to be flown in. What's more colonial than that? That some bureaucrat somewhere along the way said that you can't garden in Garden Hill? That the Indians aren't going to be capable of doing that? They've been doing that for a very long time. So a couple examples, and basic income is a very important part because it's an actual disincentive for people who make the courageous move to leave the prison system and begin to engage in employment. And I have a friend I wrote about in the book that's on social assistance and on disability, and she decided to plant a garden to supplement her income, and the food component of her disability check was cut off. So this has to stop. Stan McKay is correct. We have to do better. We need to stop advocating for things like increase the social assistance. I realize that's provocative. We need to do things smarter. Garden Hill First Nation, wouldn't it be neat in other places if we supplied a healthy food box and the healthy food was grown by a social enterprise? So we can complement income and increase incomes in a way that's being helpful. I also have a chapter in the book about complementary currencies. I was very pleased someone was mentioning that this morning, a very powerful tool to engage First Nations. So what exactly does reconciliation look like? This is a picture of our farm crew at Garden Hill. Definitely part of the Army Solvers, or the Army of Problem Solvers. Very happy people. Work is important. Work is dignity. When I grew up, my parents were going out the house, either volunteering or working. I knew what that was like. These folks, there's never been people in their family that were able to go out during the day, and so it's important. But very exciting, and we're going to transform the model. But it's important to remember that we're going to have economic solutions. We need to change the economy so that the economy is spitting out the results that we want. And government is not going to fix these problems. Only the re-emergence of the local economies will do that. These are two of my coworkers that are standing in a trench installing geothermal at Peguis First Nation. And again, $7 million of work that we've done to date, adding millions of dollars every year. And the federal government has said, no, you guys can apply for funding. And we've said, no, we're not applying for funding. This system is going to get changed. We're going to have an economy that is going to be transformative and powerful, and one that involves you and one that involves me. This is a group of ex-gang members, if you want to call them that have just insulated a basement. What's really special about this picture is that the woman there holding the baby phoned me afterwards, and this is a call we get quite often, and she said, Shaun, I feel safer in my home now. Why would an insulating job make you feel safer in your home? Because she said, now when I see these guys walking on the street, I see friends that I haven't yet met. Isn't that exciting? Reconciliation calls us into this very vibrant, very rich space. And it's important that we move towards that. So I want to just end with a story. About 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, and some of you might have been involved in the advocacy of this, but the federal government was significantly increasing the number of people incarcerated through mandatory minimums, making it more difficult for pardons and so on. You'll remember that national debate. And our NDP government in Manitoba rushed to support the legislation because they didn't want to look soft on crime. So we had a major demonstration in front of the legislature in Winnipeg, and there's maybe 500 of us there, and lots of us gathered around with signs that said jobs, not jails, and so on. But that part was pretty predictable. But I heard somebody calling my voice. I heard a voice calling my name. It said, Shaun. It's like, where is that coming from? Is that the Justice Minister saying, I got it, I understand, we're going to actually be tough on crime, we're going to invest in social enterprises, we're going to make it easy for problem solvers? No, it wasn't him. And I heard, Shaun. I was like, is that the Premier? Is he saying, no, we got it, we understand? So, Shaun, and I look up, and there's one of my former co-workers on the roof of the legislature. His name is Carson Bruce. Carson was a Cree man that never worked before, dropped his resume off at Build, and he was in between crack deals when he did that. I looked up, he had a tool belt on, he had a hard hat on, he had an apprenticeship card in his pocket, he'd completed a parenting program, he was being a dad, a father, he had a driver's license, and isn't that what reconciliation is about? But he hollered down at me something which I'll never forget. And I think he wasn't just talking to me. I think he was talking to you too. He just hollered down and he said, Shaun, what are you doing down there? So, what are we doing down here? You know, when we look back in our lives, what do we want it to have meant? And so, I think Carson wanted you to know that today, and I'm just so glad to be together and to be having this conversation. And pretty soon, let's stop talking about this and let's make it happen. Thank you very much.